Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have a most wonderful guest. Her name is Michelle Robinson, and she's the host of the podcast called Native Calgarian, which I discovered before I discovered her. But we're going to start today with a land acknowledgement. I am located in Edmonton, which is located within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis Homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. I acknowledge this land as the traditional territories of many First Nations such as the Nihiwa, Dene, Nakota, Sioux, Anishinaabe, and Niitsitapi. Michelle, would you like to do a land acknowledgement for where you are located?
You bet. Oki naganago mekoche jistakomo aki dekots nagot tine siku. My name is Michelle Robinson. I attempted to say my spirit name first in Blackfoot to honor the land I'm in, and then in Sahtu Dene to honor my people. I'm here in Mohkinstsis, which is the lands of the Niitsitapi, and this Blackfoot Confederacy has been here since time immemorial. And so I want to acknowledge the 4 tribes of the Blackfeet south of the U.S. and Canadian border, and north of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani. I acknowledge, too, that I'm on Treaty 7 land, which also acknowledges the Sahtu Dene, as well as the Stoney Nakoda. The Wesley is now the Goodstoney, and we also have the Chiniki and the Bearspaw nations of the Goodstoney. And I always acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. So just to kind of acknowledge our 60 scoop. So yeah, that's a bit about my land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That was beautiful. And I have a lot of work to do on mine. But thank you so much. That yours was wonderful. So let me tell our listeners a little bit about you. Michelle Robinson is Sahtu Dene with a weekly podcast founded in August 2018 called The Native Calgarian. Their monthly public Indigenous book club was founded in June 21st, 2016. They're a mother, public speaker, and advocate for Indigenous peoples and for truth and reconciliation, working with all levels of government and community groups. And I'm very honored to have you here with us today, Michelle. Welcome.
And vice versa. I'm really excited to be on this with you because I think the work you're doing is incredible. We need to be talking about anti-racism training, Indigenous education. So the truth is, it is my honor to be here with you today.
Well, it's a mutual admiration club then. So tell us a little bit more about who you are, your family, the land that you're on, just a little bit more personal information than what was in the bio.
Yeah, so I identify as Sahtu Dene. My Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government, that says Yellowknives Dene First Nation. So I am a voting member of the Yellowknife First Nation. And I think it's important to say that because our inherent rights make me Sahtu Dene. But with the Canadian construct and the Canadian Indian Act, I'm considered a Yellowknife Dene. It is also important to acknowledge that that's my mother's side. My father's side is so white. I am actually a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution. So I had the original folks that came over here as part of my lineage. And in the States, they really honor and respect that. So it's important for me to acknowledge that. So I literally have the best of both worlds in the sense that I have the folks who originally came here who were the original settlers, but I also have my mother and her side. And as Indigenous people are matriarchal, we really think it's important to acknowledge my granny. And she was Sahtu Dene, and her family came up all the way from Daleen. They were transferred down to Fort Providence, where the Indian residential school was for the Catholic Church. And then she went into Yellowknife after she was done her years in residential school. So that's kind of a little bit of how I came to be here. Well, my mother had a small grant to go down to Calgary to go to SAIT and take some office work training. When the money ran out, she had fallen in love with my dad. And then I popped up in 1977. So
surprise.
Yep, here I am. And my parents were very Christian religious. So they did get married prior to having me. And both claim that they didn't get married because my mother was pregnant, but they did divorce. They didn't last too long. But I do have another brother, and he lives with me actually right now. And after my parents divorced, my stepmother came into my world, and I have a half brother through them as well. So I always say I have two brothers. One is the same mom and the same dad, and the other one is completely non-Indigenous. And my stepmom is actually from Austria. So because she is, a new Canadian, I have kind of seen a lot of that anti-immigration racism through her eyes and through that experience. So yeah, that's a bit about me and where I come from. I always joked about being a native Calgarian because I didn't like it when settlers would say that. So it was my way to take it back and
I
be
love
like,
it.
oh, yeah,
That's what
I would say, what nation are you from? And then they would say, no, like I was born here. I'm like, yeah, I was born here too. But I also have, and I would talk about my lineage. So I'm like, so who are you and where do you come from? And it would offend people, but it's offensive to me for, non-Indigenous people to be identifying as a native. So.
Yeah, it's the name that grabbed my attention when I was looking for another podcast to listen to a couple of months ago. And I thought, that's a great name. Let me listen to that one.
There you go. There you go. And then I did go to SAIT myself, actually, and became a drafter for geomatics. So to me, I do think in maps, and I think about the history that wasn't taught here. When I talk about land acknowledgements, like I can give training with maps involved, because to me, that's how I see the world too. And I've recently come across as diagnosed with ADHD, and I suspect I have autism, but in Alberta, that's a $5,000 investment. And quite frankly, I'd rather go to Halifax or San Francisco for a weekend than to put $5,000 towards that. So, we'll just let that be a mystery.
If you have autism, it's pretty low.
Yeah, apparently, because as women, we are socially conditioned to placate to male gaze. It is really common for women to have burnout from the constant masking we do for both ADHD as well as autism. And that's what I'm finding that is really problematic. So for my daughter, we're working really hard at trying to get her assessed for both right away so she doesn't have to live a life of burnout the way I did.
That's great. So then you also have children, eh?
Yeah, we only had one child. And actually, that was really what got me talking about racism and training and DEI, because when I had my daughter, so I graduated high school in 1994. And just to put it in context to your listeners, Indian hospitals as well as Indian residential schools were still happening 2 years after.
Yeah.
In some cases, 3.
Yeah. And, right up to 97.
That's right. So when I talk about proximity to whiteness on my podcast, it's important to acknowledge that if my white father didn't have custody of me, there is a high chance I would have gone to Indian residential school. And when my brother got into a really bad accident, instead of going to the Alberta Children's Hospital, which he did, he may have ended up at an Indian hospital instead.
Yeah.
So it is really important to acknowledge like systemic racism. And in 2007, when I had my daughter, I experienced systemic racism at the hospital. And I knew from that I had to devote my life to talking about that because I don't want my daughter to experience what I did. My husband and I had full intention of having more children, but after our experience here, I had too much trauma. And again, had I been properly assessed and diagnosed with ADHD and autism, maybe I would have gone into birth differently. But I did have a doula. And at that time, midwifery wasn't funded. So I worked with my MLA, the late man, Mi Bular, and we got midwifery funded in Alberta because of my birth experience. And that was on the day of the midwife, which is actually May 5th of 2008. So that was when Alberta finally started funding midwifery.
That is amazing because I remember when it was funded because I had wanted so much to have a midwife when I was going through labor with my children and before and after. And when I see what my daughters and daughter-in-laws went through with a midwife, it was so much better. They had a doula, they had a midwife, they had people that were with them that helped them through all the difficulties that happen when you have a baby. And I was thinking how fortunate it was, and thinking in my mind, who should I thank? I now know it's you. I should thank you.
Well, and I will say, like, off the backs of the advocacy of the midwife groups, as well as the doula associations who have for decades have actually had been advocating for it. But what Manmeet Bhullar and I talked about, his auntie from back home was a midwife. Like, I didn't have to sales pitch it to him. And when I talk to conservatives, I always talk in money because that's how they think. And when I talked about the financial savings, that was like his hook, right? He knew as a young MLA trying to prove himself that this was something we could do, and he morally believed in. So it was wonderful. So like, I would love to take all of that credit, but the late Manmeet Bhullar, the work he did behind the scenes, which we don't see that much anymore in politics, as well as the advocacy of the midwifery and doulas. And he said to me, because I didn't have a financial gain in it, we didn't have the $5,000 for the midwife, and we spent $700 on what we thought was the best doula of the entire city, which I still think she is. And people shouldn't have to pay money to have a positive birth experience. And even by paying money, I didn't have a positive birth experience. Yeah.
Well, there's certainly a lot of work to do all around the world with birth experiences in women.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you a few questions about these groups that you so articulately explained already that you were born into. Tell me a little bit about the influences, how they've influenced your sense of culture and self.
Wow. I would argue it's still quite an anti-Indigenous environment. It's been getting better since the TRC, but I'm seeing the pushback we had this last year has been incredible. But anyway, for me personally, I was really raised to be ashamed of who I was. And I ended up having my dad and his white family, they were in full custody of me. So unfortunately, all very racist about talking about Indigenous people. So it was really hard on my heart and my self-esteem. And I really suffered immensely trying to understand. That said, I did have a white uncle who would advocate at Christmas dinner when people would go on an anti-Indigenous rampage. And unfortunately, he has since passed too. But, he made me feel proud of who I was and proud of what my family had endured in order for me to be here today. And as I learned more about Indigenous culture and specifically the policies that Canada had imposed on Indigenous people, my pride has just skyrocketed because I know what was put in place to eliminate us has actually empowered me to reclaim who I am. And my daughter gets to really focus on that and not all of the intergenerational trauma and not all of the racism. Like I teach it to her, but in a very different way where I didn't have to feel ashamed. I wasn't looked down upon by my own family dealing with that trauma and just going straight into, hey, this is the racist policies that were put in place, that are in place. This is what your mom is trying to undo. But this is your culture. This is your people. And she just focuses on, because the schools are doing better, bringing in elders, bringing in knowledge keepers. And she's focusing on, learning to bead and doing the work of talking about these things through a youth lens as opposed to an adult lens. And so it's incredible to hear that. And then conversely, I was really taught a lot of white supremacy. So I've had to unlearn a lot of that as well. Mm-hmm. My white side, like they went to World War II. So I am anti-racist. I hate fascism. I am against Nazis because I was raised that way. But ironically, what was happening to my granny and to my people here in Canada at the time in residential schools was deplorable.
Yes.
So, trying to make peace with that has been very, well, I know obviously I identify as Indigenous because I get all of the systemic racism from it. And then when I talk to non-Indigenous, I just, explain it from that point of view, like knowing what they think and where they come from. So it's been very interesting unlearning, but also navigating how to talk to people who, have been bred to believe Britain is best. We help those natives, these things that are amiss, unfortunately.
You just have to scratch the surface and it jumps out. And for the most part, it's unconscious. And people, when they realize it, are horrified and don't want to admit it, which then allows it to continue. But there are certainly very conscious and overt attempts to continue to eliminate Indigenous people. And it's something that I think that I experienced fairly closely when a few years ago I was working as an advocate for marginalized families in schools. And most of my clients that I was working with were Indigenous. And the wall of hate that hit you when you came into any institution or store was, I had suspected it but never felt it the way I felt it when I was coming in with the hated group. And that's when it hit me how bad it is to live with this every single day.
Yes.
And I'm encouraged to see that there are inroads to making things better. And I'm glad for all the work that's being done and that has been done so that we could get to that point, because it's the stain on every nation's history is how its Indigenous peoples have been mistreated in terrible ways. And when we can heal that, we will see a world that's interested in caring about the people and the planet.
Yeah, agreed. I was very lucky early on to always have such good, healthy role models in my life that were my family. So while I did have an uncle that was definitely an alcoholic, he very early knew this is not the right road. And he's been one of those folks in recovery for now decades.
Mm-hmm.
I had another uncle who became an engineer and worked for Petro-Canada and Canada and all the way up. And so he's done quite well for himself. I have another auntie who became a lawyer, one of the first lawyers. So, I've been quite lucky to always been able to counter people's misconceptions and stereotypes of my people because I've always had examples. Well, everyone that I know in my family works when people would say, natives are unemployed. And now that I'm much older, obviously, and we have reports and such to draw from, I talk about the Calgary Foundation's quality of life report that they update every year. And it is very clear that racialized Calgarians are most likely not finding sustainable work. And we're talking about 40% of racialized people. So that racism is in business right there, right? Like that number is very clear. So for me, it's been quite easy now that I understand the concept of colonialism, the concept of systemic racism, systemic poverty, systemic policies by government creating these conditions. Now I understand that. It's easy for me to explain it to other people who may not.
Also understanding the resilience and pride in your culture, which is what is going to help mitigate all of those difficulties. It won't eliminate the systems of oppression, but it gives you at least inner strength and the capacity to inspire others.
Last night, my daughter had an Indigenous family night at her school, and the elder said that you kids are the answers to our ancestors' prayers. And I believe that. I truly believe that. And it teared me right up. So I know we're moving in the right directions with our youth. And I want to continue, obviously, building on that.
Mm-hmm. So as you grew up, you became more aware of things and you chose to belong to different groups. And part of that would have been professionally. Part of it would have been ways to understand your own background. But what have you chosen to belong to, and how has that influenced your sense of self and your sense of culture and your sense of self as an advocate and a leader?
Yeah, no kidding. I love that term community because community means so many different things. I'm a part of the Calgary community. I'm a Flames fan. I'm a part of the Flames community. I'm in Abbeydale. I've always been open about where I live. So I'm a part of the Abbeydale community, but I'm Indigenous. So I'm a part of the Indigenous community. I'm Dene. So those are my people. So community starts going that way. But then there are things that obviously I feel very strongly about that I would say I'm a part of a feminist community. I'm a part of a DEI community. When you start talking about oppression and gendered violence. So for me personally, I don't not belong in some places, actually. And I think maybe it's because of that multicultural teachings we got when we were in grade 6. But I truly believe that we are very welcoming to all communities, understanding how to respect each other and speak to each other in respectful ways. Even I struggle with that. I grew up in domestic violence, so I've had to really learn how to communicate in an effective way. And now understanding that I've always had ADHD, understanding that, communication has always been something I've been in counseling for. It was court ordered when my parents were divorcing. So I've literally been in counseling basically my entire life, just trying to talk about different threads of whatever it is that I'm struggling with. And ironically, not one of them could figure out that I had ADHD sooner, but that's fine. I have learned how to communicate this in a really productive, I hope, constructive way. Sometimes I do get tired And I'll just tell people, if you're so committed to misunderstanding, you are wasting my time. And I don't engage with folks like that, right? Like, you and I obviously have read a lot of different reports and such. So when you have a layperson, trying to basically waste your time without pay, it's like, no, we live in a capitalist society. You want to learn, you can pay me. If you don't want to pay me, are you really committed to learning? And then conversely, the other part is everything you and I have to say literally is in a book. So if you have a public library subscription somewhere, you really don't have an excuse.
What I'm talking about is that things that you feel have influenced you. So, and I'm going to give you two examples. One example is I was working with an Edmonton Indigenous group for some project. I forget what it was a number of years ago. And it was in a really, really difficult area of the city where they would have a cooking night and then people would serve the food and the community was welcome to come. And so I was standing in the lineup, waiting for dinner. And everybody was so welcoming and friendly to me that it was just bringing tears to my eyes. And I was thinking, here are people, many of whom were houseless, and they were just so welcoming, like as if I was just part of the whole family. And I just felt very honored and very touched by that. And then the man who was in front of me said, "You look like you've been working all day. I think you should go ahead in the line and go in front of me." And I just burst into tears because I couldn't believe that his generosity of spirit was so beautiful. And I thought that really affected me. And it made me think, in what ways can I show better generosity of spirit with all the people that I work with? So that was one experience that was pretty significant, I think, in that sense. And another one is that I have a long history of being associated with people from Iran. And a lot of my friends are Iranian. And they have a specific thing that they do. When people walk into a room, everybody gets up and greets them. You don't start anything until each person who's come in has greeted each person individually. And it's very reverent and respectful. And I have worked for years to adopt that into my other situations, just because I thought this is an influence that would be lovely for everybody. So those two things really affected the way I wanted to be and how I wanted to move towards. So it wasn't moving against something, it was moving towards something. I'm wondering what you found that you wanted to move towards that's influenced you.
Well, obviously felt very strongly about all birthing women and mothers, parents having a positive birthing experience. That to me, I found very much that there were solutions. I found with Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that our elders who had put their efforts towards explaining their stories, to me, that was very clearly going to be my mission in life, is to now always honor those words, always honor all of our elders who took the time to testify in that. And then, of course, with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls in Two-Spirit inquiry, the same thing, these families who had traumatic loss and yet were able to tell Canada in the hopes to find solutions. So to me, I always do look at what are the solutions. And those are the things I advocate for the most, because the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the 231 calls to justice in the National Inquiry. There's actually another report I love to advocate for, because I'm in Alberta and we always talk about money and economy. So I talk about the National Indigenous Economic Strategy that has tons of recommendations in it as well. Because to me, these are solutions. These are things that a lot of background work was done. A lot of voices need honoring. Those voices are in these reports and these recommendations. So the very minimum I can do is always honor that. And when I understood the gravity of what had happened to us through Indian policies by Canada to us, like I knew that will be my life work, that I will always be advocating for all of those children that were lost in this country in order for Canada to exist and continue to lose their life, unfortunately. So for me, it's always that I want to honor our ancestors. I want to honor their voices, because unfortunately, a lot of voices that spoke at both of those, as well as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, like they died shortly after. They told their story and then died. So the very minimum we can do as a country is honor those voices. It was safer to go to World War II than it was to Indian residential schools. And that's a stat that we should always be very mindful of, and recognize that if we are going to put that much reverence into Remembrance Day for the right reasons, in my opinion, we should also do that every September 30th for the same reason.
So let's talk a little bit about your temperament and personality. Temperament, things you're born with, and also your social environment affect you. So I'm including both of those. And then personality is things that you add on. And sometimes people are just adding on what they're already good at. And other times they're adding on something new that affects them. And it might be an interest, but it can also be an inspiring story from another person that affected you and that you're moving towards as well. So what would you say you were born with? What's your temperament? Oh, yeah, she's always been like that. Michelle was the one. And she was too. She was like that. And then the things that you added on as you grew older.
Yeah, it's a great question because I've just been unthreading what ADHD is for me as I've only been recently diagnosed with it. And I've always been what they considered stubborn, always strong-willed, always outspoken. That is me. And I don't know if it's from a sense of injustice. I don't know if it's the ADHD. I don't know if it's the childhood trauma of watching my parents literally fist fighting, but I've always been outspoken. Always. Am I always right? That's debatable, but I at least try to explain why I feel so strongly about something I do. And then now that I'm much older, obviously I try to do it with a little more humility because the moment you think you understand something is the moment you meet a new person that explains it in a different way that makes you reconsider how you look at it. So I really do respect listening to other voices on topics of injustice or oppression, but also of that bigger picture of healing. Healing is a lifelong journey for me. And so I love hearing other people's points of view on what healing was for them and looking at how do I incorporate that in my world so that I'm coming from a good place when I say things. And that's something really common that I hear regularly from anyone in my culture is that, make sure you're saying things from a good place. And I know facts hurt some people's feelings. So I do try to say them in a way that maybe are less painful, but there are times that the truth is a truth. And I'm just going to say the truth. And most people aren't used to hearing it. And unfortunately, we haven't really talked about white fragility, but that is something that I come across. And I actually like to use the term settler fragility because a lot of folks are multicultural now and they come from all around the world, not just Europe, and they see things through a different lens. And have unfortunately also been taught misinformation and untruths. So anti-Indigenous bias. It is multicultural now. So I do prefer to talk about it through a settler lens in that sense, because even my Mayflower people, they were original settlers. And so talking through it through that lens, talking about colonialism, but at the end of the day, equity. The intent of the treaties was equity. And so to me, because those were a spiritual covenant from our people to the newcomers, if I'm always coming from that place of our goal is equity, that's what matters. I'll never tell someone, you need to go back home where you come from, because that wasn't our intention as treaties anyway. Now, Canadians haven't been taught that, unfortunately. So my hope is one day they will be taught they are treaty partners and they have obligations to those treaties. And hopefully one day our kids will also be taught the same lesson of, our ancestors made treaty obligations and we want to honor that. Mm-hmm. That's my hope.
So you would say then you were outspoken and stubborn as a child, and you have kept all of that to fuel your determination to bring about equity and justice.
Yes.
And that it has become tempered by the fact that you don't want people to run away screaming.
That's just it. And I do want to honor, not just I have to carry myself in a good way, mm-hmm. because I don't want to disrespect the Sahtu Dene. I don't want to disrespect the Yellowknife Dene First Nation band. And I also don't want to disrespect the treaty partners of Treaty 7 when I'm on their land, right? So I have a lot of obligations to my people to carry myself in a better way, because if I don't, then my people rightfully will say you need to step down from that mic, and they would be right.
Yeah, if we temper our comments with the fact that they need to be honest and kind at the same time, then
and love.
Yeah, because kindness comes from love and honesty comes from the desire to know and to speak the truth. So if you put the two together, it's a pretty powerful combination, but each one alone may be missing some oomph from the other side. So, can you recall a time when you became aware that your understanding of the world was specific to you? I mean, you mentioned the incident at the dinner table with your uncle standing up for you and other people being anti-Indigenous, and that would have possibly been one moment, probably cognitive dissonance moment, a cultural dissonance moment. But can you think of some other times when that would have particularly struck you that what you understood to be normal was not what others understood to be normal?
Mm-hmm. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about the birth of my daughter. For a lot of folks who may not know, because I have an Indian Act imposed status card, my health care is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And unfortunately, the practice in medicine in general is that when they see that, is to have assumptions about who this person is and where they come from. So although I considered myself a professional that cheered for the flames, drafted wells and pipelines for the oil and gas industry, and was a contributor to society, when I got into that birth room, unfortunately, I was a negative stereotype according to the doctors, nurses, and hospital staff. And so that unfortunately really not just hurt me and traumatized me, but also showed me what you thought is not true. The truth is this. And the stats prove how many Indigenous women go and give birth and their children are apprehended out of a racist policy. But I was told falsely by my white family, but not you. You know, you're different. You're unique. And unfortunately, because of their ignorance of systemic racism and the impacts of that, that is why I had such a horrible birth experience. I just assumed, like all of the other folks in my life, that if I had a doula, I had my husband, you know, we went into the hospital, I would be treated equally and the same as all the settler mothers who were giving birth, but it wasn't like that at all. And so that was really pivotal. That really changed the course and direction of my life. And I wanted to go back to work, but I just see life so differently now. Like, it's not enough to say it. Like, I just see the world so differently now that I just see my purpose, you know, recognizing the voices of my ancestors, trying to dismantle systemic racism the best I can in my lifetime and moving forward in a better way. And the truth is, with midwifery, you know, that is a great example of patriarchy that had to be dismantled in order to allow birthing moms to have a better experience.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back a little bit to what you said when you first started talking about the birth experience. Most of my coaching clients are people who are professionals who have been marginalized in their profession. In fact, I'd probably say all of them. Marginalized because they're women, because they're people of color, because they're Indigenous, because they're new to the country, because they have an accent.
Sure.
And they don't believe the red flags that they're seeing because they drink the Kool-Aid of this is Canada. That doesn't happen here. And it blindsides them. And I think it's a deeper moral wound than if they would have known ahead of time that just because we say something doesn't mean we're doing it or that we mean it even. So that might have been less hurtful. I don't know if it would have been or not, but it might have been less hurtful. And to think that, you know, what's around us is ignorance. It's not truth, it's ignorance. Because people are just so terribly wounded by this. They go, you know, how could this happen when this is Canada? And I think that your experiences speaks to that. That's just
100%. And quite frankly, every day I have to unpack that. And I actually do call that white supremacy.
Yeah.
Because, for example, I naively believe that if I worked with the police, I could help them with being less racist and maybe less murders against Indigenous people. But unfortunately, my experience taught me the opposite and kind of back to that moral wound. So I do call it naivety. I naively thought I could help the police. I was honored with a Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Award for my work with the police. But unfortunately, the numbers are clear. And the work they have to do is just not what they're willing to do. It's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And down here in Treaty 7, we had the Beowulf Report that actually had led to the creation of the Tsuut'ina Police, the Blood Tribe Police. And, you know, unfortunately, we're talking decades and we're still at that point where I don't feel comfortable calling the police. I'm advocating for police to get out of schools and, you know, a very much a lone voice on that, unfortunately, because marginalized folks do drink the Kool-Aid. Myself, I was one of them. And it took a lot of research for me to understand the systemic building of police structures within our society. So, and that's not a lot of work a lot of people want to do.
Yeah, totally. Did you ever read the book, My Grandmother's Hands?
I haven't, but many people have said I should read it.
Have they told you why?
Oh, because I talk so passionately about so many things. But I have found this, Marie, unfortunately, there is only so much time in the day to read so many books. So I have started to limit what I will buy, and I had to create my book club literally so I will read those books.
I know what you mean. Well, the reason I'm mentioning this one is because the man who wrote it is a psychotherapist and his brother's a policeman. And they're both Black with Indigenous backgrounds as well. And so he talks a lot about the work that it takes for people who are in the frontline police work to undo their own stressors and their own traumas and to be able to respond in a situation of high conflict. And also to be in a situation where they don't respond out of the lens of racism that's encouraged by the system of the police. And it's really interesting to hear how he talks about his brother essentially perpetrating the same violence and stereotypes and then being horrified by his own actions and how they moved past that. It's quite an amazing book and really honors the role of the ancestors in helping people to regain their sense of resilience and strength and equity and justice. So I just thought I'd mention it. But, my rule is if 3 people have told me that I should read a book, that's when I decide to put it on my list.
Well, you would definitely be more than 3. And I'll tell you, when I ran for public office, both municipally and provincially, I truly do believe that first responders in general, police obviously included in that, they aren't given proper cultural training, but they're also not given proper cultural trauma healing.
Yeah.
So again, back to that conversation about healing, we were very stagnant here in Calgary of having a chapel and having folks who were running them that were anti-Indigenous and racist in general, as well as anti-2S LGBTQ+. And so if you had an Indigenous lesbian police officer going into this place, she was not getting the help she rightfully deserved. And conversely, many different cultures that, we should be honoring and cherishing within our police services, they're not getting their proper cultural healing services as well because of how we've, of course, built the policing structure. So to me, I naively thought when I ran that we could start not just putting in anti-racism training, but also including cultural healing for all of our first responders. Because I had heard about a Calgary firefighter who was Indigenous who ultimately unalived themselves. That is so preventable had we had proper services in place. And I just feel strongly and passionately for that. But even getting the first part of the training is so difficult in people committed to misunderstanding and not wanting to move forward in a good way. So back to that naivety too. Mm-hmm. So from a good place, to be fair. So
yeah, trying.
Yeah.
Even if it's misdirected. So what brings out the best in you when you're working with people? What allows you to really be your true self?
Oh, my favorite thing, and I say it at the end of my podcast, is to really honor the next generations. I hope every word I say, every bit of effort I put towards does help the next generations. And I think about my daughter and the world that they're inheriting. And then, of course, the next generations, the world that they're going to be inheriting. And I also, of course, do it with that place of honoring my granny just recently passed away 1.5 years ago. And my mother is struggling with health issues as well. So, just knowing that I actually have the luxury of speaking when they didn't.
Yes.
So, yeah, I really try to come from that place of gratitude, knowing that I'm lucky enough to have the mic for the first time. I don't know a Sahtu Dene woman who ever did. And with that comes a lot of responsibility, not just for my ancestors, for myself, but also the next generation. So that's, I believe, brings out the best in me, knowing that that is the roots of where I need to be speaking from every time I do speak.
And imagine if everybody did that. If everybody thought, how's this going to affect the next generation and the next 7 or 14? Or is this something that if I would be proud of or that my future family legacy would be proud of? And it might color the way people approach work. So I really appreciate you saying that. Is there something you would like to promote?
Geez, I really hope that people legitimately take time to read. But if they cannot, there are wonderful podcasts like this one that they can listen into. There are also documentaries as well. And a lot of books are now audio books as well. So, I just really encourage people to, once a year minimum, listen to a book you wouldn't normally listen to or read a book you wouldn't normally read. Now, I used to read as a kid and I read now. So I read a lot of books and reports and people's points of view a lot more than most people, and I'm lucky enough to have that time. So my hope is for folks who are, working their 40 hours a week, that maybe you could fill your time with listening to somebody on the way home or the way to work with something you'll learn from. And it doesn't even have to be just Indigenous. It can be from the Black community. It could be from a multicultural community, an immigrant experience. It could be from a gendered lens experience, whatever that looks like. And the other part is we're more than just trauma. So, for example, we have amazing musicians. We have amazing people in science, academics, all sorts of people who do fun things. So, like, if you're into science fiction, there's Indigenous science fiction. There's Black science fiction. It's out there. And so if it has to be fun, if it has to be something that fills your cup, what is it that fills your cup? I love Star Wars. I love it so much. That's all I think about, talk about, and want to consume any downtime with. Lord of the Rings, same thing. Mm-hmm. So like a lot of indigeneity in Lord of the Rings or Star Wars is something I just gravitate towards. So we only have one life, obviously, and we all want to treat each other with respect. I believe that's a human value. So let's do that and think a little outside the box. I have to listen to, very right-wing programming and radio just to understand why people think the way they do. Granted, I was raised in it. It surrounds me. It's like in the air. But that bigger picture of just making sure that I challenge those thoughts, again, rooted in love and kindness.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end the podcast today?
Yeah. So reconciliation action groups, I have one here. Wherever you're listening from, there is a reconciliation committee somewhere. Make one in your work, make one in your sports club, whatever that looks like, so that way we can all be working towards reconciliation together.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your life and your passion. So wonderful. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And thank you for having me on this journey with you. So grateful.
It has been a blessing. Having grown up in Canada with her white father, Michelle Robinson believed that her professional accomplishments and confident presentation skills would shield her from the racist attitudes of others towards Indigenous people. Yet when she entered the hospital in labor with her daughter, the hurtful, dismissive treatment she experienced from the moment she showed her Indian status card shocked and surprised her. This pivotal moment later caused her to begin a personal journey of investigating the history of her people, healing her own wounds, and launched her work as an Indigenous rights activist. Michelle feels belonging within all three of the peoples who contributed to her existence in this world and offers her unique gifts to the world with cultural pride and knowledge. I enjoyed my informative interview with Michelle Robinson and encourage you to listen more about the Indigenous experience by listening to her podcast, Native Calgarian, available on most podcast directories and on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Newsflash! Listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the Fan List link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.